Good morning and welcome to today's webcast, Medicare Update 2021 Inpatient Prospective Payment System Final Rule. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us. We're pleased to present another in our ongoing series of continuing professional education webcasts to help companies and individuals conquer challenges as they plan for what's next. Our presentation will start in a few moments. Before we begin, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can customize how you both view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can also adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, each relating to a different aspect of our session. You can download the group attendance sheet and a PDF copy of today's slides from the slide deck and handouts widget to the right of the slide view. You can ask our presenter questions during the webcast by typing a question in the Q&A window below the slide view and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions during the presentation or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty during today's presentation, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session will offer you 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the requirements as specified by the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of the polling questions, which we'll ask throughout today's presentation. To respond to a poll, click the button next to your answer. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget to open a PDF file that you can save to your computer. Don't worry if you can't download your PDF certificate today. We'll email a copy to you in 2 weeks. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our attendance sheet to receive CPE credit. The attendance sheet is available in the slide deck and handouts widget. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. Also note that CPE credit can be awarded only to participants registered as themselves and isn't available to participants who view the on-demand version. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to see isn't legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Jonathan Mason and Glenn Bunting, both directors at Moss Adams. And with that, I will turn it over to Glenn to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Emily, and good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As is typically the case when CMS issues a final rule, we have a lot of material to navigate through over the course of the next hour. As many of you know, on or about September 2nd, a couple of weeks ago, CMS posted on the internet the 2,160-page final rule covering changes to the Inpatient Prospective Payment System, which is effective on October 1st, 2020. The purpose of today's webcast is to provide a broad overview of significant policy changes CMS has finalized in their rule as is published in this document. So as you can see on your screen, what we have is an overview of the payment rates, a change to GME reimbursement, MS-DRGs. We're going to cover Medicare bad debt pretty thoroughly. This is an area of interest. Medicare wage index, Medicare disproportionate share, uncompensated care pool, PRRB changes, and also there's a proposed rule out there for Medicare Part C, which is separate from the IPPS final rule, but we want to make sure we cover that, as well as provide you with some COVID-19 funding and Medicare cost reporting guidance. So there's a whole host of topics on today's agenda. So with that, let's dive into the payment rates. And let's start off with some good news here. What we found when we went through the final rule is that the IPPS payment rates are expected to increase 2.9% on average for acute care hospitals that participate in the hospital IQR program and are meaningful EHR users, which is the majority of the hospitals across the country. This is comprised of a 2.4% market basket adjustment and a 0.5% adjustment for documentation and coding, which gets back to prior legislation. Urban hospitals are projected to receive 2.5% higher payments, and rural hospitals are projected to receive 2.2% higher payments. Overall, acute care hospital payments are expected to increase by $3.5 billion as compared to the current fiscal year 2020. So on your screen, we provided a comparison and a breakdown of the fiscal year 2021 DRG payment rates by labor, non-labor, and capital as compared to the current fiscal year 2020 DRG payment rates. Overall, these Medicare per discharge payment rates are a little bit more than $168 per discharge higher, or 2.69% greater than the current fiscal year 2020 rates. However, the final rates are approximately $20.69 lower than the rates that were previously proposed in the IPPS rule earlier this year. Probably one of the more controversial changes that was implemented by CMS in the final IPPS rule has to do with the setting of MS-DRG relative weights using a market-based approach as compared to the current cost-based methodology. And this change really originates from the agency's price transparency rule issued in November of 2019. CMS believes that using a market-facing approach as compared to a cost-based approach in MS-DRG relative weight development will more align provider charges to Medicare IPPS payment rates. So for all you that fill out a cost report every year, CMS will instruct hospitals to include on their cost reports a calculation of their median payer-specific negotiated inpatient service charges for Medicare managed care, also known as Medicare Advantage organizations. CMS is going to begin collecting this data for cost reporting periods ending on and after January 1st, 2021. So for some organizations that have cost reporting periods on a calendar year basis, they're going to start to need to begin to prepare for this change shortly. CMS plans to implement this data into the MS-DRG relative weight development beginning in federal fiscal year 2024, which is really only 3 short years away. So I'm sure as we move forward, there's going to be more and more information about this, but this is what was codified in the final rule issued on September 2nd. And so with that, we're going to begin with our first polling question. So I will turn it over to Emily.
Thank you. Our first polling question: did you or your team comment on CMS's FFY 2021 IPPS rule making? And your options are A, yes, B, no, C, unsure. And I'll give everyone a few moments to respond. To participate in our polls today, please click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. I'll give everyone just another moment here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you.
Looking at the results, to me, they're not surprising, but then again, you never know what you're going to get on this type of a polling question. I think the low number of yes comments probably has a lot to do with the environment that we're in with COVID and trying to, maintain hospital operations and a lot of extra things going on this year. But overall, the polling is not too surprising here. So moving forward, we will talk a little bit here about GME. There was one significant policy change that we'd like to bring to your attention, and this is in regard to CMS's position on displaced residents. So currently, CMS applies a strict rule of defining a displaced resident as one training at a hospital or in a program the day before the hospital program closes, and there's really no exception to that. And that will be the way it is up until October 1st, and there will be a change, and CMS is expanding that displaced resident rule to include residents that were training at the hospital or in a program on the day that the closure was publicly announced. Or they will include residents that were accepted to train at a hospital or program but had not yet begun training by the day the closure was publicly announced. So in short, what CMS is doing here is they're expanding their standard, and they've created a new standard for determining a displaced resident is really the public announcement date going forward and not the program closure date. So that's a bit of good news for hospitals that end up in that situation. With respect to MS-DRGs, one of the more controversial MS-DRGs over the last few years has been for the CAR T cell therapy. CAR T cell therapy, for those that you don't know, is a cancer-fighting therapy that's very new, but it's very expensive. CMS has established a new payment group that's intended to help compensate hospitals for CAR T costs. So as such, now that a new MS-DRG payment group has been established, CAR T will no longer be eligible for a new technology add-on payment. But speaking of new technology, CMS has approved a total of 24 new technology add-on payments in fiscal year 2021. So this is really, in my view, really an unprecedented move by CMS. We're routinely used to seeing only a handful of new technology approvals in a given year, often only a few. CMS appears to be moving in a new direction, approving more new technology add-on payments than in the past. CMS will be more than doubling its new technology Medicare spending at an anticipated amount of $874 million in fiscal year 2021. Another section here that's of real concern to a lot of folks is Medicare bad debt policy changes. I know many of you are interested in the outcome of CMS's newest policy changes to Medicare bad debt. As a matter of background, CMS has often proposed changes to Medicare bad debt, whether it's been to the amount of reimbursement paid for bad debt through legislative action or through changes in policy. Bad debt is one of the more controversial and subjective areas in Medicare reimbursement. In fiscal year 2021, in the proposed rule, CMS proposed many changes to Medicare bad debt that are intended to be both retroactive policy changes and prospective policy changes, or in many cases both. So for purposes of this presentation, we're going to dissect the changes to Medicare bad debt using the following bad debt patient classifications. So first, we're going to talk about policy changes applicable to the non-indigent Medicare beneficiaries. I refer to them as Medicare traditional patient population. And that population would be subject to a credit and collection policy effort. Second, we will discuss bad debt policy changes applicable to Medicare beneficiaries determined to be indigent under a provider's financial assistance policy. Third, we're going to talk about bad debts related to dual eligible Medicare beneficiaries, also known as Medicare crossover patients. And then finally, we're going to discuss the proper accounting of Medicare bad debt as it relates to contractual allowances and other general ledger accounts. So let's start with the Medicare traditional patients that are subject to a credit and collection effort. CMS has made a final determination that for bad debts prior to October 1st, 2020, which is the period we're currently in, they're required to issue a bill shortly after discharge or death. However, after October 1st, 2020, hospitals must issue a bill within 120 days after the later of the date of the Medicare remittance advice or the date of the remittance advice from the beneficiary's secondary payer, or the date the beneficiary's secondary payer does not cover the services furnished to the beneficiary. The write-off of a bad debt cannot occur until at least 120 days have passed since the issuance of the bill, and the 120-day period will reset each time the hospital receives a partial payment. So in short, what we're seeing here is there are more stringent defined requirements that should help alleviate the subjectiveness when it comes to the audit and review process. CMS also amended its regulation to require hospitals to employ similar collection efforts between Medicare and non-Medicare beneficiaries. In our view, this is a little bit problematic because every patient will have a different set of financial facts, so employing a similar collection effort, not to be confused with a similar collection policy, across all payers is really going to be difficult to implement. Providers are prohibited from claiming bad debts while they're attending at a collection agency, and this simply codifies existing CMS policy. Providers would have to furnish upon request bad debt collection policies, patient account history, the patient's file documenting all collection efforts made. And so this raises a good question in terms of, do these changes impact your existing agreements that you have in place with outside collection agencies? Folks may have to go back and look at those agreements and modify and make changes accordingly. So moving forward, let's now discuss the Medicare bad debt determined for indigent patients covered under a provider's financial assistance policy. CMS has proposed providers will have to take into account a patient's total resources in determining indigence. So in the proposed rule, CMS lined out that you would have to be looking at assets, liabilities, income, expense, and make sure that there's no other sources of income that are legally responsible for payment. So as a result of the proposed rule, there was a public outcry. And between the proposed rule and the final rule, CMS actually backtracked to only requiring income and assets be considered in determining indigence, which is really the same standard that we currently have, or the same standard as before. So CMS also decided against adopting this standard retroactively. So in short, what happened is CMS ended up codifying the existing policy effective 10/1/2020 and made no further changes. So, at the end of the day, this really was considered a big win for the provider community. For the Medicare crossover population, CMS is codifying their must-bill to the Medicaid program policy. What they're doing is they're stating that you must bill the appropriate Medicaid agency to see if the Medicaid agency has an obligation to make payments. And the proof of billing would be the Medicaid remittance advice. However, if the state has no obligation to pay, alternative documentation to a remittance advice can be submitted as noted in the slide. The 100-day billing rule mentioned in the previous slide would also apply here to the Medicare crossover population. So you have to be aware of the fact that you still have to apply the 120-day billing rule. And then these policies for this population are effective both before and after October 1st, 2020. So they're both retroactive and prospective. With respect to the proper accounting for bad debt, in the proposed rule, CMS was going to prohibit providers from claiming bad debt written off to contractual allowance accounts in their financial accounting system. CMS had proposed only bad debt written off to a bad debt expense account could be claimed for Medicare reimbursement effective on October 1st, 2020. However, through public comments, it was pointed out that CMS was contradicting its past statements and position on this issue. CMS had defined bad debt as reductions to revenue that must be recorded in revenue accounts, not expense accounts. So therefore, are we back to square one, or are we? CMS acknowledged their error in the final rule, but also claimed it is improper to write off a bad debt to a contractual allowance account. So what CMS decided was for periods prior to October 1st, 2020, hospitals must report bad debt to a bad debt expense account, even though they had acknowledged this was inconsistent with their past position. CMS's pre-October 1st, 2020 position of writing off bad debt to an expense account contradicts their prior public service announcement issued on April 4th, 2019, wherein they stated they would not require hospitals to report bad debt to a bad debt expense account for cost reporting periods prior to October 1st, 2019. A lot of confusion in terms of the prior to October 1st, 2020 time period, and I just suspect there'll be more coming out from CMS on this. However, CMS decided for periods after October 1st, 2020, hospitals must write off bad debt to an uncollectible receivable account that results in a reduction of revenue. It cannot be written off to a contractual allowance account and be considered bad debt. So with that, I will turn it back over to Emily with our second polling question.
Great, thank you. Our second polling question: do you feel your hospital is going to need to expend significantly more resources to comply with CMS's revisions for Medicare bad debt reporting? And your options are yes, no, or unsure. I'll give everyone a moment or two to respond here. As a reminder, if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. And just another second or two here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Glenn, back to you.
Yeah, I think the polling on this, oh, I see, it's changed on me here. It is a little bit across the board. I mean, I see yes, no, and unsure kind of all the same. In my view, I think there are more restrictions that we have to be aware of when it comes to Medicare bad debts. I foresee that we are going to have to expend more resources to claim bad debt. However, the amount of bad debt that you're going to actually end up claiming on a cost report will probably be less as we kind of move forward. What CMS really is trying to get at here is to have us in the hospital community work those bad debts more and more before you make that ultimate decision to put them on to the cost report for reimbursement. So with that, we're going to move from Medicare bad debt into Medicare wage index. So as a refresher, which is what this slide is about, the Medicare wage index factor is derived from salaries, benefits, contract labor, and paid hours reported annually in your Medicare cost report. The wage index factor is developed from this data, and it's used as a multiplier in the determination of Medicare payments. So as noted in the slide, the Medicare wage index factor has a long reach into the stream of patient revenues at almost every organization. In short, the higher your wage index factor, the greater your payment, and vice versa. So you can see that the wage index factor, many of us just look at this as something that's applicable to inpatient and outpatient PPS payments. But in the state of California, it's used for the Medi-Cal program and their disbursements of reimbursement. It's also used in other areas like skilled nursing, inpatient rehab, inpatient psych, other Medicare payment systems. So it's something that you don't want to ever lose sight of. I've always said that the Medicare wage index factor plays a role in approximately 90% of your Medicare payment. So keep that in mind as you deal with the wage index factor. There's a number of factors that impact the calculation of the wage index in fiscal year 2021 that CMS actually implemented in the prior year. First, they made a change to exclude from the rural floor calculation hospitals that reclassify from urban to rural. These urban hospitals instead have their own reclassified status. Second, they increased wage index values for the lowest quartile hospitals that were paid for by the highest quartile hospitals. So for fiscal year 2021, that 25 or 25th percentile wage index value has been determined to be 0.8457. So any hospital at or below this mark will receive a redistribution in terms of the calculation of the wage index value. And that redistribution is paid for by the hospitals that are at the highest 25th quartile. CMS also implemented a 5% temporary stop-loss adjustment to anyone experiencing a wage index reduction as compared to their prior year wage index value. There were a number of other changes to wage index factor development as noted on the slide. I'm only going to call out a few of these significant changes. First, there's a change in the labor market delineation from OMB 1804, which we'll cover on the next slide. Also of note is the federal fiscal year 2021 wage index factors are developed from the 2016 occupational mix survey. I know a lot of us are going through and doing the 2019 occupational mix survey. That data will be used in next year's wage index factor development. Also of note is the national unadjusted average hourly wage in fiscal year 2021 is $45.27 as compared to last year's unadjusted average hourly wage of $44.19. So there was a gain nationally of $1.08. Kind of as a rule of thumb, if you have an unadjusted average hourly wage of $45.27 in federal fiscal year 2021, your wage index value is going to be 1. That's the baseline. Also, all things being equal, if the overall average hourly wage of your core base statistical area did not rise by at least $1.08 an hour in fiscal year 2021, there's a likelihood that your wage index factor will have decreased between years. CMS this year issued, actually it was last year, OMB issued Bulletin 1809, and CMS has adopted this as an update to labor market delineation. So in their development of their fiscal year 2021 wage index factors, CMS implemented the changes in OMB 1804. So as you can see on your slide, we have 34 counties that are going to convert from urban to rural status. 47 counties will convert from rural to urban. 140 counties now qualify for the Lugar designation. 19 counties are going to move from a new or modified urban area. And 31 CDSAs will change names and or number designations. So a lot of change here. The labor market changes from the OMB Bulletin 1804 impact every Medicare payment that is developed using a wage index factor. So this has an impact across the board to everybody. The temporary stop-loss rule of 5% that I spoke of would apply for hospitals receiving this adjusted wage index factor, but there's no relief for healthcare entities receiving an unadjusted wage index factor. So that's your SNFs, your rehabs, your psychs, home health, hospice, ESRD, and others. The changes in labor market delineations can also impact special statuses of neighboring hospitals that are not directly impacted by change. Some of these changes are gradual, as you can see in the first and second bullets, while other changes could have an immediate impact, as noted in the third bullet. So be aware of these changes and take it into consideration in terms of how it may or may not affect you at your particular provider. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Emily with our third polling question.
Thank you. Our third question, do you regularly consider the financial impacts your wage index factor has on non-hospital payments other than Medicare inpatient and outpatient? And your options are yes, no, sometimes, or I'm unsure. And for those of you that would like a copy of today's slide deck, you can download them from the folder that says Slide Deck and Handouts to the right of the slide view. I'll give everyone a few more seconds here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Glenn, back to you.
It looks like, it's a pretty split full here, and it doesn't surprise me. Some folks are a little more in tune to wage index factor and the impacts that it has on, you know, the non-acute care setting, basically, while others don't give it much consideration, or they don't have non-acute care settings to be concerned with. But, you know, the important point here is that your wage index factors not only impact yourself, they impact others outside of the acute care hospital setting. And so keep that in mind as you move forward. So finally, as we close out the wage index section of our presentation, we provided a couple of slides outlining the upcoming wage index and occupational mix survey timeline. Many of you are likely aware of the fact wage index and occupational mix survey review season is in full swing. It's important to you and your neighboring hospitals that everyone do their part to reply to the MAC's data requests. The MACs have a tight turnaround on this. They have a deadline of November 16th, which might seem like it's a ways away, but it really isn't. And that deadline is to complete their review of wage index data for all hospitals nationwide. As I kind of move forward on the slides, there's some other deadlines a little further out. The PUP file will be released on January 29th, and then if you aren't satisfied with the results in the PUP file, you have a very short turnaround on February 16th to respond and submit requests, and then the timeline kind of goes on, but the deadlines dwindle, I guess is the best way to put it, as you move forward. So with that, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Mason, and he will give us an update on Medicare DSH and uncompensated care.
All right. Well, thanks, Glenn. We'll spend kind of a good portion of the rest of the time covering the UC payment section of the rule and understanding how the pool size was determined and ultimately the calculation proposed to distribute those funds to Medicare DSH eligible hospitals. So there was a pretty significant change in the size of the distribution between the proposed and final rule, and we'll dive into what made up those changes. So just to set the stage for everyone listening, the size of the UC payment fund is first determined by two factors. Factor one is the difference between an estimate of what would have been paid to qualifying hospitals under the historical DSH formula, and then the 25% empirically justified amount. And so the sources of this estimate is the most recent available projections of Medicare DSH from the CMS actuary, the most recent filed cost reports from qualified hospitals, and the most recent DSH data from the IPPS impact file. So this DSH estimate begins with an anchor period. In this case, it's the 2017 data, which is then trended forward by a number of factors applied to the 2018 through 2021 periods. And so as you can see on this slide, there are four main factors. And I'll stop here and mention that the values in green represent an increase compared to the proposed rule, while red represents a decrease. And so now the majority of the comments on factor one raise concerns regarding the adverse economic effects resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic and how the current factor one data elements did not take into account this pandemic. So these comments cited CBO and other studies regarding the increase in the unemployment rate that would in turn generally cause an increase in Medicaid enrollment. So for the final rule, CMS did state that they updated their models to account for the unique economic situation presented by COVID-19. But at least in terms of factor one, not in the manner the commenters had envisioned. And so actually, after now taking into account COVID-19, the end result is a decrease in their factor one calculation compared to the proposed rule. So the two main categories that were updated due to COVID were the discharge figures for 2020 and 2021, along with the case mix figures for those same 2 years. So as you can see on the slide, the discharge factor for 2020 takes a significant drop to 0.891, and that's down from 0.9756. And from the rule, CMS is basing this on preliminary data from 2020. And actually, in the Office of the Actuary memo on Factor 1, the term they use is actually very preliminary data for 2020. And so for 2021, they go on to state the same assumptions that were stated in the proposed rule regarding the attempt to factor in how many beneficiaries will be enrolled in Medicare Advantage plans. And so all of this led to an actual decrease in the Factor 1 calculation. So I think perhaps the Office of the Actuary memo sums it up best, and I'll quote it. Since we do not know how many Medicare beneficiaries will choose to enroll in a Medicare Advantage plan, or how the remaining fee-for-service enrollees will use hospital services, or the total impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, there's much uncertainty in these numbers. And so, however, the memo goes on to state that they believe these assumptions used are reasonable. And so as you can see, the 2021 estimate of what DISH would have been absent the Affordable Care Act is $15.171 billion. This compares to the proposed rule total of $15.359. And so after adjusting for the empirically justified amount, the resulting Factor 1 equals $11.378 billion, and that's $141 million less than the proposed rules. And that actually amounts to over $1 billion less than the 2020 Factor 1. So this slide gives you a quick view of Factor 1 since inception of the program in 2014. You can see that every year Factor 1 has increased until this final rule, where now instead of an increase, there's an over 8.5% decrease in the Factor 1 calculation. And so that kind of leads us to Factor 2. So before we get into kind of the significant change from the proposed to the final rule for Factor 2, I'll first set the stage. Factor 2, also known as the reduction factor, reduces the UC pool calculated in Factor 1 based on the change in the national uninsured rate. And so the result of this adjustment ultimately establishes the net uncompensated care pool to be distributed to qualifying hospitals. So as with the comments received on the proposed Factor 1, the majority of comments discussed the proposed Factor 2 related to the COVID pandemic. So stakeholders urged the Office of the Actuary to update its projections of the rates of uninsured for 2020 and 2021. So many of those commenters cited the substantial increase in the unemployment rate and the likely loss of employer-sponsored health insurance, using references from the Bureau of Labor Statistics as well as independent research groups. And as we'll see on the next slide, CMS did take these comments into consideration and updated their projections in an attempt to include the impact of COVID-19 on the change in the uninsured rate. On CMS's website, they have posted an addendum to the Office of the Actuary memo that goes into greater detail on the methodology and the assumptions used in the updated calculation. So kind of in summary, they used the past estimates from the National Health Expenditure Account as a baseline, and then updated those based on the more recent data. And so they used more recent historical data on the rate of unemployment published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as well as they updated the economic projections of the data as published in the monthly Blue Chip Economic Indicators report to better reflect kind of the impact of the pandemic health emergency. So CMS Office of the Actuary estimates the uninsured rate in 2013 was 14%. So for calendar years 2020 and 2021, the estimated uninsured rate is 10.3% and 10.2%. And so the calendar year values are then converted to a payment year using the weighted average approach to get to 10.2%. So after running this through the formula, Factor 2 now equals 72.86 as compared to the proposed rule of 67.86. So to get to that final UC calculation, you then apply the 72.86% uninsured rate to that 11.78 Factor 1 to derive an uncompensated care pool of $8.29 billion. And that'll be distributed to around 2,400 qualifying hospitals. So this actually represents a $474 million increase. That's a little over 6% in total compared to the proposed rule. However, I guess in the end, the 2021 final rule UC payment is a $60 million decrease compared to 2020. And so as you can just see from a trending perspective, the UC pool in 2014 was $9.033 billion, and then steadily declined as the rate of the uninsured declined in the U.S., or at least what was estimated to decline using CBO data. CMS switched to a new metric in 2018, and as a result of those changes to various factors that impact coverage under the Affordable Care Act, the rate of uninsured ticked up in 2018 and 2019, with it basically being pretty much flat in 2020. And now we see kind of in 2021, the final UC total is very close to 2020, but how we got there is completely different. And so as we just covered, we saw that significant drop in the size of Factor 1, but we saw an increase in projection in the uninsured rate related to COVID. And those kind of essentially canceled each other out to keep the final total relatively consistent compared to the prior 2 years. And that kind of leads us to Factor 3. So CMS is finalizing their proposal to use federal 17S10 data to derive Factor 3. This applies to all hospitals except Indian Health Service and Puerto Rican hospitals. They are also finalizing the decision to use the definition of uncompensated care as reported on S10 line 30 for this year and subsequent years. And so just kind of as a refresher, line 30 includes both charity and bad debt, but does not include Medicaid or any other indigent program shortfalls. And so one major point that CMS addresses that they finalized in this rule is the use of the most recent available single-year audited S10 data for Factor 3 in all subsequent years. And so that's obviously a signal that these S10 audits that have occurred the last few years are here to stay, and that CMS expects there to be recent audits on these S10s to pull for future Factor 3s. You know, they kind of go on to state that they expect the number of audits to increase in future year cost reporting years as a result, believe, you know, the best available data will be from S10 cost reporting years that have been audited. And CMS is actually currently auditing the federal 18 cost reports for all DSH eligible hospitals, you know, unlike the last few years where they've only audited pretty much only a quarter of the DSH eligible providers. And kind of speaking of audits, CMS saw quite a few comments from stakeholders regarding Worksheet S10 and the current audit process. And I've just listed several on the slide. The big takeaway is that the provider community is looking for a more consistent and equitable audit across all providers and MACs, and to develop transparent timelines for the audit and kind of to allow more time to gather that data, resolve differences that occur at audit, and really respond to those audit adjustments. You know, some ask for some type of appeal process for adverse audit determinations. Kind of CMS responded by stating that the audit protocols are provided to MACs in advance of the audit to assure consistency and timeliness in the audit process. You know, they don't plan on introducing any type of audit and appeal process such as wage index, as it would require too much resources, and they actually even go on to state how this could negatively impact other audits if they had to shift audit work around. And so they also stated that at this time, they would not establish fixed start dates for audits across all MACs. And I think that brings us to our next polling question.
All right. Our final polling question: for the ongoing 2018 S10 audits, are you surprised by the level of detail requested by your MAC and or the amount of time and resources it has taken to respond to these requests? And your options are yes, no, or unsure. Once you have completed all CPE requirements today, you will be able to download a PDF of your CPE certificate from the CPE progress window to the right of the slide view. We'll give everyone just another moment here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Back to you, Jonathan.
All right. Well, those results are are not surprising. I think from just hearing from our clients, several that were very surprised at kind of just the level of detail that these auditors are taking right now and just the level of time and information required. So to see 42% say yes is pretty much on par with what we're seeing as well. And so kind of in the interest of time, I won't go into detail very much on these next two slides. Two of the main points, the cost to charge ratio trim methodology and the UC data trim methodology, those are the same processes they've had the last couple years. They established it as CCR ceiling, and then on the UC data, they're comparing the UC costs. And if they fall outside the norm, they'll be trimming those. Those usually only affect a handful of providers, usually less than 10 per each year. And then in regards to calculating interim uncompensated care payments, CMS is continuing to use the average of the 3 most recent year discharges for setting the UC payments. And so they are now finalizing the proposal for a voluntary process through which hospitals may submit a request to lower their per discharge payment. And so this process should only be considered for significant recoupment, such as 10% or more of the total UC payment, or at least $100,000. Another item from the rule that impacts S10 reporting, where we've received some clarification, is with the topic of implicit price concessions as it relates to the accounting standards update, topic 606. So based on the FASB update under topic 606, an amount representing a bad debt would no longer be reported separately as an operating expense, but treated as an implicit price concession and as a reduction in patient revenue. And so there was a question with the implementation of this new standard and how it may impact Worksheet S10, kind of the non-Medicare and Medicare bad debt. But CMS has addressed this and will recognize the topic 606 terminology, and these implicit price concessions will be recognized as a bad debt on Medicare cost reports. So kind of now I want to switch gears and take a few minutes to talk about the underlying data from these cost reports that determine a hospital's UC payment. Earlier we discussed that the 2021 UC payment was derived from a hospital's 2017 cost report. And we think that it's a good idea that we take some time to look at the results from the previous round of audits to see what kind of impact this ultimately had on hospitals and the overall pool distribution, especially in light of all 2018 S10s currently being audited. And so the analysis we're presenting today from HCRIS is the change in the federal 17 cost reports that occurred between 10/1/19 and 6/30/20, which the final rule was also pulled from the 6/30/20 date. So these hospitals all qualify for UC reimbursement based on 2021 rule. So there was approximately 650 audits performed in on the 2017 year, but as you can see, there was a total of a little over 1,100. So we saw quite a few that just a fair number of hospitals that either kind of amended their cost report during this time. And so for these hospitals, line 30, which is the sole data point for calculating a hospital's UC payment, decreased by almost 7%. And so that's close to $1.9 billion in UC costs removed from these S10 cost reports. So if we dig a little deeper in what made up that $1.9 million change, here we're showing the change in line 20 charity care charges, and you can see that 659 had updated charity totals. And the biggest change I'd like to note is the change in the insured charity. That was decreased by over $1.7 billion. That equates to about a 42% decrease. And so these insured charity dollars were a point of emphasis on the 17 audits. The MACs were verifying that these insured charity dollars were only associated with coinsurance deductible copay amounts. I think it's pretty clear from this analysis that there were some significant findings in that area by either the hospital through their own research or in conjunction with the audit. And with this slide, we see that 633 fiscal years were revised for total bad debt. Again, the change was massive, with $3.2 billion representing a little more than 11.5% removed from those S10 reports. I think the inclusion of bad debt sampling and a more robust bad debt review in the S10 audits is the biggest cause for this decrease. You know, we know from our experience of reviewing filed S10s from this time period that some hospitals were still reporting bad debt from their provision, you know, which in some cases could be considerably different than the actual patient bad debt activity. So in summary, what do all these numbers mean in actual UC reimbursement? Because I don't want that to get lost with all these changes on S10. So this table summarizes the results of the changes for these 1,100 providers we just walked through. So the average impact is a loss of $414,000 in UC reimbursement. We also saw some huge swings, with the largest decrease having an approximate $50 million hit on the hospital's UC reimbursement, and the largest increase equating to an almost $11 million pickup on their 2021 UC payment. So what are some next steps and best practices in terms of UC and Medicare DSH? You know, as we mentioned earlier, MACs are currently performing Worksheet S10 audits on all federal 18 fiscal years. So hospital systems really need a designated individual or team of individuals to prepare the S10 for filing and support it during the audit process. You know, these S10 reports take a considerable amount of time and resources to prepare. Providers should take another look at their federal 19 cost reports to make sure they've accurately captured all uncompensated care on those cost reports and decide if they need to amend before these are most likely subject to an audit early next year. And one last reminder for you today regarding Medicare DSH and S10 is that CMS is now requiring that hospitals must submit patient detail that ties to the charity amounts claimed on S10, as well as the Medicare DSH totals at the time of the cost report filing, or that cost report will be rejected. The patient detail must be plus or minus 3% of the cost report values to be acceptable. This requirement began for cost reports starting on or after 10/1/18. So CMS has not published an exact template for S10, but hospitals will need to provide at a minimum the charity detail that ties to the cost report and include fields such as patient name, social security number, and write-off amount. And just kind of as the last reminder for this, that the filing deadline for DSH amendments based on the OPPS rule timeline is 12 months after the original as-filed cost report deadline. So kind of quickly, we want to address an update that may be coming regarding the processing of appeals with the PRRB that was covered in the final rule. CMS is giving authority to the PRRB to potentially mandate electronic filing of appeals. These instructions could come from the PRRB as early as 10/1 of this year, and if and when the instructions are published by the PRRB, there will be a 120-day notice before the updates goes into effect. So we want to recommend that those who have not already, but may use this in the future, sign up and begin using this system as soon as possible to allow time to become familiar with the program. And we also kind of, as Glenn mentioned at the beginning, we also want to take a moment to mention the latest development in terms of the ongoing Medicare Part C litigation as it relates to Medicare DSH. On August 6th of this year, CMS published a proposed rule in response to the recent Alina Health Supreme Court ruling. So in this rule, CMS proposed that Medicare Part C days be included in the SSI fraction of the Medicare DSH patient percentage for discharges before 10/1/13. So this is a retroactive rule that will apply to any open cost reports with periods beginning before 10/1/13. And so as you may recall, this follows the same methodology that was prospectively adopted in the 2014 final rule And it's also the same methodology that was included in the 2004 rule that was later vacated through litigation in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. It was also addressed in a 7-1 favorable decision for hospitals by the Supreme Court in June of last year. So CMS cites that they continue to believe that a patient enrolled in a Medicare Advantage plan remains entitled to benefits under Medicare Part A and should be counted in the Medicare fraction of the DSH patient percentage and not in the numerator of the Medicaid fraction. CMS goes on to state that it's in the public interest to maintain the status quo. So in the proposed rule, CMS states that there is no economic impact because the fiscal years that would be impacted have already been settled consistent with this policy. Kind of their alternative proposal to include these days in the Medicaid fraction could have an impact of up to $600 million in Medicare DSH payments. But that estimate is only for 2013 and does not cover the entire time period back to 2004. There are also some assumptions made in this single-year calculation that hospitals should review. So these Medicare Part C days have been subject to litigation for well over a decade, and hospitals have prevailed numerous times in court. And this proposed rule, if it's finalized as is, would negate those victories. So hospitals are obviously strongly encouraged to engage in the rulemaking process through comments, and I think the deadline for that comment period is October 5th. And so I think with that, I'll hand it back over to Glenn for some kind of final thoughts and wrap it up.
All right, thanks, Jonathan. As we kind of wrap things up here, we wanted to provide some guidance on COVID-19 funding as it pertains to the Medicare cost report. So we've inserted an informational slide covering provider relief funds, PRF, and other COVID-19 related financial benefits, giving you guidance to show how these items should be reported on the Medicare cost report. At Moss Adams, we have a dedicated team of consultants that really they live and breathe this information daily. In fact, there was a new announcement issued by CMS yesterday that one could argue makes this slide, which we just prepared last week, kind of obsolete. So this is a fast-moving area. If you have any questions regarding PRF or COVID-19 funding, please feel free to reach out to either Jonathan or myself or anybody at Moss Adams, and we will be sure to connect you with the appropriate team handling this topic within our firm. We also have a resources slide here, which I won't comment too much about, but it'll be part of our post-presentation slide package. And also, we wanted to give a shout out about our Moss Adams Healthcare Conference, which is usually held each year in Las Vegas. But this year, due to the pandemic, it was canceled. However, we have relaunched the conference in a virtual format. We currently have 6 sessions remaining over the course of the next 2 months with interesting topics and well-known speakers. I am particularly interested in the session on October 29th, which we have our usual political counterpoint this year with Newt Gingrich and Donna Brazile. So that should be of very much interest because it's right before the presidential election. With that, I think we are about finished here. I don't know, Emily, if we have time for any questions.
We are just at the top of the hour, so we are out of time for questions. However, I know we got a number of questions in the queue, and we will do our best to follow up with you after the presentation. So thank you, Jonathan and Glenn, for a great presentation today. As I mentioned, if you asked a question and we didn't have time to answer it, we'll do our best to follow up with you afterwards. You may also reach out directly to Jonathan or Glenn with their contact information here. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window to the right of the slide view. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE Progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. Here is a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete this survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again next time.